Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. All right. Yeah. Here we go.
Now we're going to get into two contrasting approaches with the Middle Ages, though. Two people called Paschasius and Ratramnus. So they're going to go to two different extremes when it comes to what it is that we think of the Eucharist. Paschasius is going to tend more toward the realism and focusing on Jesus really physically being in this bread. Ratramnus is going to go in the other direction of Jesus just being symbolically in this bread. Why it's so important is because these were two monks who were actually in the same abbey in Corbie, France, which simply means that they lived together. And what happened was one wrote a book or a treatise on the body of Christ, and then the other one read it and said, this is not so. So he wrote he wrote a book with the same name, essentially saying how it was that the first person was wrong. And they lived together. Right? Sort of like modern day conceptions of family, right? So this is back in the 700 and 800. So Paschasius, for instance, lived from 785 to 865. He was the abbot, or the head of the abbey. And he wrote this work called De Corpore et Sanguine Domini, or in English, On the Body and Blood of Christ. So what was his work about? About the body and blood of Christ. After he wrote that then, Ratramnus, who lived in the same abbey, wrote a tract or a treatise, a book, with the same title, in response to that and also answering questions that the emperor had addressed to him. Imagine when the emperor writes to you saying, what should we believe about the Eucharist? That's pretty serious stuff. So Ratramnus now is being called to answer both to his abbot. His abbot has written a book, and also the emperor is asking him his opinion. So what's he going to do? Is he going to agree with his abbot? He's going to come out with something very different. In fact, the same title, De Corpore et Sanguine Domini, but a very different take on the situation. One of the things that we see going on in these two, Paschasius and Ratramnus, is that neither of them really understood this concept of anamnesis, or anamnesis if you prefer. That simply, the early church, every time they broke the bread and drank the cup, what were they doing? They were remembering Jesus and his death. That's what anamnesis or anamnesis, if you prefer, means. It's simply a remembering. They were remembering his death. By the Middle Ages, we were largely forgetting about that theology, if you will, about us remembering Jesus' death, and we were focused on other things, like that bread, and how it is that Jesus jumps down from heaven and into that bread. If Jesus does that, or is Jesus just symbolically in that bread? Is Jesus really in the bread, or is Jesus symbolically in that bread? Paschasius is going to say, Jesus is really in the bread, and Ratramnus, Jesus is symbolically in the bread. The problem for both is, the question essentially is, how can something be the reality if it's only the image of the reality? Going back to all this with the prototype and the image, how can something be the prototype if it's really only an image? That image that we have of Jesus, that's not really Jesus, right? It's not Jesus, it's just a picture of Jesus. It's an icon of Jesus, it's an image. But with the bread, you're telling me that this bread that I hold in my hand, that it's really Jesus? Is it really Jesus? Or is it an image of Jesus? Who's going to win the debate? So Paschasius is defending the unity of the figure and the thing, or in Latin, the figura et res. So the figure is what we're going to refer to here as the image, and the thing is the prototype. So Paschasius is arguing that the two are united. So that in this case, what happens? The sacramental body of Christ, the bread in your hand, or back then on your tongue, because we didn't receive it in the hand. The bread on your tongue is the historical body of Christ. Follow me now. We're talking about different bodies of Christ. The twofold body of Christ. The first two then are the historical Jesus. When Jesus lived on this earth, he had a body like you and me, right? If he cut himself, he bled. He had a historical body. The second one is the Eucharistic body of Christ, the bread and wine. So Paschasius is saying the bread and wine are the historical body of Jesus. Jesus' historical body, the same body that hung on the cross, the same body that was buried, is what you're eating when you go to communion. You're munching Jesus' bones. You're eating his flesh. That was Paschasius. So the reality, he was arguing, is present in the food. The prototype is in the image. He was arguing that Christ is in the bread. For him, there was no distinction between the real body of Jesus and the sacramental mode. They're the same thing. What you're holding in your hand is Jesus' body. What you're holding in your hand is the Eucharistic body of Christ. What you're holding in your hand is both. There was no distinction between the two. What you receive on your tongue, that's Jesus' historical flesh. The conceptual identity of two levels of reality. Paschasius wrote, "We receive in the bread that which hung on the cross." That physical body that hung on the cross with Christ, that's what you receive on the tongue. The Eucharistic elements are changed through the word of Christ into the flesh and blood of Christ. That bread, that wine, they're changed into the body and blood of Christ. Do you notice how different this is from the discussion that happened 7 centuries before them? 7 centuries before then, the disciples simply gathered to share bread and a cup of wine. There was not all of this trying to figure out what's going on there. Now by the Middle Ages, we're trying to figure out how this is possible. We're trying to use philosophy and all the theology that we have to try to understand what it is that we believe. And so Paschasius is saying that bread and the wine are changed through the word of Christ, right? Every time we go to Mass, we say the words of Christ, "This is my body." So they're pointing to that moment when you say Christ's words, "This is my body," that there is a change that takes place where the bread becomes Jesus' historical flesh. He said the Eucharistic elements are changed through the word of Christ into the flesh and blood of Christ, and they become identical with the body of Christ, born of the Virgin, who suffered, died, and is now in heaven. He also said, "It is indeed the true flesh of Christ, which was crucified and buried." That's what you receive on Sunday when you go to Mass, according to Paschasius. One view. So for him, it was all on the thingly. We see the image, the bread, but the prototype is in the bread. Jesus is in the bread. His historical flesh is in the image. Ratramnus, is Ratramnus going to agree with his good abbot? Being a good obedient monk, is he going to agree with his abbot? Actually, he's not. So for Ratramnus, the bread and the wine are figurae, or figures. They veil the presence of the body and blood. Remember the word symbol, again, comes from the Greek word symbolon. The elbow was the symbolon, which simply meant that it connected to the upper arm with the lower arm. The symbolon connects the upper arm with the lower arm. What does a symbol do? It connects us with another reality. So the bread is a symbol. It simply connects us with that reality of Christ. Is the bread Christ? No, the bread is a symbol. It connects us to that reality. How interesting that Ratramnus said that they veil the body and blood, because the ancient belief, the belief of the early church, was that the bread and the wine actually reveal rather than veil. So reveal and veil come from the same Latin word. To reveal is to take the veil off. So the ancients were saying that the bread and wine reveal the body of Christ, that Jesus is revealed in the bread and wine, the veil is taken off. Ratramnus is saying that the bread and wine are a veil. You can't see Christ. What you see is bread and wine. It's like a veil, right? You can't see beyond the bread and the wine. Under the veil of the visible, the corporeal, the spiritual body exists. So all we see is the visible, the bread. But inside that bread, under that veil, if we were able to take off that veil, what we'd be able to see is the spiritual body, which is the body of Christ. So for him, there's this distinction between body, the physical, and spirit, that thing that it signifies. Under the veil of the corporeal bread and the corporeal wine, the spiritual body and the spiritual blood exist. So there's the spiritual body and the spiritual blood of Christ that exist within that corporeal, or that material, bread and wine. It's not as though they are two things distinguished among themselves, body and spirit. Rather, there is one and the same thing. According to one way, it's bread and wine. According to another way, it's the body and blood of Christ. But it's one thing. This bread and this wine symbolize the body and blood of Christ. So is there any physical change in the bread? No. The change is simply in how you understand it. After the priest says those words, then we understand, we believe that it's the body of Christ. See the difference in thinking there? According to one way, it's actually changed physically. Jesus is physically present in it. According to the other way, after those words, we believe that it's the body and blood of Christ. Even today, there are different people with different Eucharistic theologies, simply meaning that some people believe that Christ is present in that bread. Others see it more as symbolic of our unity. Is one person right and one person wrong? Different ways of looking at the Eucharist.